to our lecture presentation. The few remarks before we start. I think everybody in this room, almost everybody, remembers Dr. Clem Cunningham, who passed away early last month at age 96. I thought we would give him a little tribute today, remembering what he actually did in his life, and I think he's a big reason that we are actually here today. He was born in April of 1922 in Rock Island. He graduated from Street School of Medicine, which is affiliated with Loyola University in Chicago. He graduated in 1945, end of World War II. He was in military. He spent 5 years serving, and just a couple interesting stories from that time. He was serving as a ship physician, and he mentioned transporting judges to the Nuremberg trials in Europe at that time. Another story that he said that while on board the ship, he also participated in a secret military program called Paperclip. This was a government program, in which German scientists were recruited and shipped to the United States for government employment. He was later appalled when he learned that many of these well-mannered and nice people, as he interacted with them on a ship, were actually participants of Nazi atrocities in the concentration camps. He got married in 1947, raised 4 children, 3 boys, 1 girl. One of his sons is here with us today, Pat Cunningham. For the sake of time, I had to skip a long line of services and leadership positions he held in the hospitals, medical societies, and the church. What really changed his life, he started as a family physician practicing Rock Island, but in 1953 he became a member of National Federation of Catholic Physician Guilds. In one of his emails, he recalled seeing a pamphlet from this Catholic organization, and he just went after it and signed. He also established first local guild. It was called Linarker Guild of Rock Island. It was the predecessor of St. Thomas Aquinas Guild. In 1916, he was already active enough by that time that he received, for his activity in the late apostolate movement, he received St. Thomas More Award by the National Council of Catholic Men in Washington, D.C. This is a picture of him receiving the award. In 1963, he was elected as a president of the National Federation of Catholic Physicians Guilds, which is, again, different name for what it is now, Catholic Medical Association. He was elected at their annual conference in Detroit, Michigan. At that time, this represented 6th largest medical organizations of the United States with about 7,000 members. I call this presentation, Men Who Met 3 Saints. He happened to meet his first saint in early 1970s while he was in Vatican on behalf of this Catholic medical organization. And he met with Pope Paul VI. His canonization will be tomorrow. Will be a saint. The previous slides is just to show you how it looked in actually 1961. This picture is from his archives, again supplied by his family. This is a meeting in New York in the Commodore Hotel in 1961. I was just a few months old at that time. During the challenging years after Second Vatican Council, it was a dry period. Dr. Cunningham remained a stalwart supporter of magisterial teaching and kept carrying the torch. In 1995, as a member of Alois Council 658 Knights of Columbus, Dr. Cunningham met with his second saint, Mother Teresa of Calcutta. She was canonized in 2016. And this was while she was visiting one of the branches of the Missionaries of Charities in Peoria, Illinois. In recognition of his personal service to the Holy See, to the Church, and his excellent example set for his community and his country, Dr. Cunningham received papal honors from the third saint that he made personally, then Pope John Paul II, as he was installed as a Knight of the Order of St. Gregory. This is the second picture with the Pope, and this is his picture with that medal and his wife. In 2015, and that's where this picture is from, he was recognized for his lifelong service as a distinguished guardian of faith during the 84th annual meeting of Catholic Medical Association in Philadelphia. At that time, he was 93 years old. That's a picture when he was 93. His candle was burning steadily for 96 years. He didn't hide it. He let it shine so that everybody could see his good work. Albert Schweitzer once said, "Sometimes our light goes out, but is blown into flame by another human being. Each of us owes deepest thanks to those who have rekindled this light." Dr. Cunningham was such a human being. Thank you. This leads me to my introduction of our speaker today, Dr. Ashley Fernandes. He's traveling from Ohio State. He's the Associate Director of the Center for Bioethics at Ohio State University College of Medicine, and is an Associate Professor of Pediatrics at Nationwide Children's Hospital. He received an MA in Philosophy from Johns Hopkins University in 1999, and MD from the Ohio State University in 2003. And then he went on and received Ph.D. in Philosophy from Georgetown University in 2008. He's board certified in general pediatrics, focusing on bioethics and professionalism, education, scholarship. He also practices both hospital and ambulatory pediatrics. So he's in the trenches. He's a fellow of the American Academy of Pediatrics, elected member of the F.A.A.P's executive committees on bioethics. I will not bore the audience with other titles that you have. He's a presidential board of trustees of Ohio Right to Life, and has been a member of the Catholic Medical Association since medical school, which awarded him the National Mentor of the Year award in 2015, the same year that Dr. Cunningham was awarded. He lives with his wife Shruti, a family physician, and two boys in Dublin, Ohio. Please help me to welcome Dr. Fernandes.
All right, sorry, we're having technology problems. I think I'm gonna, I need to use this, or is this okay? All right, great. Well, thank you everybody for having me. I am Ashley Fernandes, even though I don't look like an Ashley Fernandes. It's good to be back here. I used to come here when I was a debater in high school. The Quad Cities, see, some people don't realize this, but the high school debate teams in the Quad Cities are known nationally. They're very, very good. So we would travel from all over, from Ohio. People would come to the Quad Cities and for debate tournaments, so we could get a little bit better by learning from you all. So that's actually served me very well. And a note about Clem Cunningham, when I was a medical student at my first national CMA conference, I met him. There were only 3 of us at the time that would go to the conferences, and he took us under his wing. And in 2015, he still remembered my name. It was incredible. So I'd gone every year. I would see him. He would say hello. But I just couldn't believe. I had lunch with him in 2015 at the conference in Philadelphia. And he remembered my name, which I thought was amazing. But it just shows you the kind of man he was. And we'll miss him around here. All right. Well, I'm going to talk about a serious subject. Let's see if this works. And we're going to talk about euthanasia, assisted suicide. And what I'm going to try to do is give you all some arguments and some reasons to oppose this, even if you weren't Catholic. So there's really not a good philosophical or medical reason for euthanasia or assisted suicide. But the people that support it aren't crazy. Okay, so this happy guy, now how'd you like to be married to him? This is Karl Brandt. And Karl Brandt was the German physician who was in charge of the euthanasia programs under Nazi Germany that ultimately killed over 70,000 adults and mostly disabled children. And he was put on trial at the Nuremberg trials, and at that trial, he offered this defense. And I'm going to read this to you. And as I read it, I'm going to show you some images. I want you to reflect on what he's saying. So this is Karl Brandt in 1946. He says, "The human beings who cannot help themselves and whose tests show a life of suffering are to be given aid. This consideration is not inhuman. I never felt it was not ethical or it was not moral. But one thing seems necessary to me, that if anybody wants to judge the question of euthanasia, he himself must go into an insane asylum, and he should stay there with the sick people for a few days. And then we can ask him 2 questions. First, whether he himself would want to live like that. And second, whether he would want one of his relatives to live that way, perhaps his child or his parents." Now, that is not the intellectual reasoning of a madman or a monster. That is something that we hear every single day, if you work in medicine, from people that support euthanasia and assisted suicide. And I point this out only because it's persuasive, right? My medical students that I teach are very persuaded by that line of reasoning. And if I read that to them and they didn't know it was a Nazi doctor who said that, they would be very persuaded. Does anybody know who this is? This is Brittany Maynard. You probably remember her, most of you. She was dying of brain cancer, and she launched a campaign for death with dignity, as she called it, for assisted suicide. She died on November 1st in 2014. She left her home state of California to access the assisted suicide laws in Oregon, and it is believed that she was in large part responsible for California legalizing assisted suicide 2 years later. She says, "I can't even tell you the amount of relief it provides me to know that I don't have to die the way it's been described to me, that my brain tumor would take me on my own. I hope to pass in peace." And does anybody know who this is? Yeah, see, nobody knows who this is because the media suppressed this woman's story. This woman is Kara Tippett, and she died in May of 2015. And what you may not know is that she had terminal breast cancer, and she penned an open letter to Brittany Maynard while she was still alive, asking her to reconsider her decision. And this is what she said: "Suffering is not the absence of goodness, it is not the absence of beauty, but perhaps it can be the place where true beauty can be known. You have been told a lie, a horrible lie, that your dying will not be beautiful, that the suffering will be too great. I get to partner with my doctor in my dying, and it's going to be a beautiful and painful journey for us all, but hear me, it is not a mistake. Beauty will meet us in that last breath." I show you this because we have our narratives too. Narrative can be a powerful element of persuasion, particularly in our culture where reason is kind of put on the back burner. But it's very important, especially for physicians and people who take care of the sick and the dying, that we tell our narratives as well, because that is what can work to help to change people's minds. I'm going to now talk about some arguments in favor of assisted suicide and euthanasia. And the first one is this argument from autonomy. Okay? So, in the argument from autonomy, basically, this is the philosophical argument that says you get to decide what to do with yourself and your body. Okay? And we hear this all the time. On this version, okay, this is based on an anthropological argument that basically says that there's nothing transcendent about the human being. Okay? You are a random collection of atoms, and when you die, you become worm food, and that's it. Now, this is the predominant philosophical anthropology that exists in medical schools today. It's called materialism, and it basically says all you are atoms. If you have this view, and if you believe this view, then what happens is the only thing you really have control over are the neurobiological elements that constitute your choice. Okay, autonomy is just these firings of these neurons that allow you to believe that you're in control. And so the worst thing that can happen is for someone to take that control from you, for someone to stop your choice from happening. Realize there's nothing transcendent, there's nothing empirical about truth, so therefore truth takes a back seat, right? What's true is what you choose. And this is a very dangerous anthropology. People don't realize the implications of what this means. Love, then, is choice. It's non-interference in the decisions of another. The basic strategy: to control and then change the language. Okay, so here, terminal sedation becomes palliative sedation, or continuous sedation until death. Oops, is what they call it now. Physician-assisted suicide now is called medically assisted dying. So notice it's open to others besides physicians, like PAs and nurse practitioners. And then also, in Canada, it's now called medical aid in dying. And now this is the preferred term in the academic literature. MAID. Oh, MAID. Helpful. Helpful. I cannot get an article, I'll tell you this, I cannot get an article published in a national journal if I say physician-assisted suicide. They will make me change it to MAID, or medical aid in dying. The Hemlock Society becomes end-of-life choices, and then that wasn't good enough, so they changed to compassion and choices. And then Brittany Maynard in the language of experience. So this is getting people out there to tell their story about how horrible death is. So, this is a really interesting article from Bloomberg. How do you change someone's mind about abortion? Tell them you had one. Okay, this is an article about how the gay and lesbian movement has offered their services, I guess, or Planned Parenthood and the National Organization of Women and so forth, Abortion Rights Action League. They have gone to the gay rights leaders who had their campaign for gay marriage because they saw that within a 5-year span, public opinion on gay marriage swung all the way one way. And why was that? Because when they went on CNN or they went on MSNBC or they went on the mainstream, they were showing couples and their stories and how they were denied a marriage license, and that really had an effect on people. And they think that that's how people change their view. So in the abortion movement, they're trying to do the same thing. They're going to go out and they're going to start telling people about the days when you couldn't get a legal abortion, or about how much they needed that abortion to have done. And the assisted suicide and euthanasia movement is doing the exact same thing. Okay, they're going out and telling their stories and hoping to change people's minds. The opposite of this is this idea of Christian personalism, which St. Pope John Paul II talked about, that there is something transcendent about the human person. There is something beyond our material selves. And if we believe that, if we believe that the human person is actually a community of persons, that that's what we are, a communion of persons, that changes everything. That changes how you view the end of life. Now suffering might have a meaning beyond choice. All of a sudden, a human being is relational. So it's not enough for you to say, I'm suffering alone. a human being always is with another, and you can't even be a person without the other. This is Jacques Maritain, a famous French philosopher, and he says, in truth, if human society were a society of pure persons, the good of society and the good of each individual person would be one and the same good. So here the focus switches of what's the ultimate unit of value. It's not choice. It's the person herself, this person in front of you, not the person, not humanity en masse, but this person in front of you. And if you build a society like that, it's so much the better. And now imagine what would happen if the doctor-patient relationship were built on that kind of value. Okay, the second argument that people will give is the compassion argument. And this argument says that it's compassionate to help compassionate choices, right? It's compassionate to help people who are suffering and dying at the end of life. I'm going to show you from empirical evidence why that's wrong, why that's a misnomer, but think about the word compassion, to suffer with another. Okay, if you say, I see you're suffering, but I really don't want to see that anymore, so I'm going to help you. I ask my medical students to imagine yourself asking for assisted suicide to a doctor who then affirms that yes, you need it. Okay? The empirical evidence I'm going to show you a little bit later will show you that the number one and number two reasons why people want to commit suicide is a loss of control and that they feel like they're a burden. And by a doctor affirming that decision and saying, yes, in fact, you are a burden and I'm going to help you, that's a very, very bad thing. Now, how about this argument from suffering? Okay, this is the argument that people suffer at the end of life, and it's often confused or conflated with this idea of pain. So people will say people have a lot of pain and suffering at the end of life. The first part is actually factually wrong. People don't die with a lot of pain anymore at the end of life. Okay, and the second part is, people, I'm sure there are people that are in pain, but the point is there something we can do that's short of killing them to relieve that pain? And the second thing is suffering has become, on the materialist model, the thing we ought to avoid, right? So if you don't think anything happens after you die and there's nothing transcendent about the human person, then it actually is rational to put up with suffering as long as you choose to, and when you can no longer do that, you probably should off yourself. Because there's nothing, you're just worm food. So why would you want to suffer any longer than you have to? I do understand that, but the problem is the anthropology is wrong. This last argument is the argument from dignity, where you hear death with dignity, that the people are losing their dignity at the end of life. So suffering is an affront to human dignity. They'll say euthanasia allows a person to preserve their dignity in death. But the problem here with this philosophical argument is it doesn't account that there's this difference between inherent dignity, which is what every single person from the time of conception is born with, and attributed dignity. That is, our perception of their dignity. So it's a question of distinction, right? When someone wears a silly hat, they don't lose their dignity. They might become undignified, but they don't actually lose their dignity. And if someone at the end of life wets themselves or can't control their bowels and they're lying in their own waste, that is something that is undignified and something that ought to be corrected, but not by death. Because that person still has a human dignity that is inherent and that doesn't go away with the amount of suffering that they endure. Dignity, as Pope John Paul II has said, is both a call and a demand. Okay? It's a call to us to accept and affirm that relational element of the human person, but it is also a demand from those who deserve it. And those are, like this picture, the most vulnerable in our society. There's also this argument people make from the philosophy of medicine. They say that it's a physician's duty to relieve their patient of suffering at the end of life, and this has been called the principle of non-abandonment, that once you get to the point, it's like this sort of fifth principle they're trying to promulgate now, you get to the point where medicine can do nothing, then the only thing you can do is medicate someone to death. But, see, you can make anything sound good by calling it a principle. Doesn't that sound good? It sounds like you're actually reasoning it out and that this is like something, wow, this is really good. It's a principle. I'm sticking to my principles by helping this patient kill each other. But we have this response. The response is the physician's role is not consistent with killing, and this goes back at least as far as the Hippocratic Oath, but the goal of medicine is to heal, to restore. It requires presence, the presence of another person. And yes, that is hard, but think back to that competing anthropology of Christian personalism, right? We cannot be persons without the relational element. When something is wrong with another, we will never be the same until we can help them to heal and restore that. And this is something from the literature, 2016. The median length of a physician-patient relationship in Oregon is 12 weeks, but some much less, even less than a week. This is the physician-patient relationship for assisted suicide, okay? So they're talking about how this is a principle of non-abandonment, but they barely know this patient. And the empirical evidence supports this. These people who are helping others to kill themselves barely know their patients. Now, they don't tell you that in the media. The physician-patient relationship, we could also argue, has its limits, right? So there's always been limits to medicine. There were limits to medicine in the time of the plague. There were limits to medicine in the time of the Spanish flu. There are limits to what medicine can do. Even though we can do a lot of stuff, there are limits to what we can do now. But what is not limited is the amount of presence a physician, a nurse practitioner, a PA, and other healthcare providers can provide by just saying that they're going to be there for their patient, even if they don't medicate them. So, the most important thing here, from our point of view, is that you have this relationship. A person that trusts their physician, or their healthcare professional, or their nurse, is less likely to feel that they are a burden, is less likely to feel abandoned by them, even if that person doesn't do what they ask them to do. And this is why it's important to frame this as a covenant and not a contract. All right. This is my other key point, is that physician-assisted suicide is not good medicine or good for medicine, okay? Good medicine asks, is the problem reversible or irreversible? Is it treatable or not, right? Whenever you have a patient with a pathophysiology, that's what you ask. And is the intervention going to make the patient better? In this case, the patient who is being helped is not even experiencing the helping because they're dead. They're no longer a subject. It's the oddest thing. It says, I'm going to relieve this patient of suffering as if the patient exists beyond the intervention. It's the only thing I can think of in medicine where the patient isn't even aware that the intervention has occurred and cannot benefit from it because the subject in which you're intervening ceases to exist. So it's sort of a use of the English language that makes it seem like you're helping the patient when you're actually killing the patient, and therefore the subject no longer exists. All right, let's talk about this, and this is why we're really here. This is the bulk of my presentation, is empirical data shows serious abuse. Now, if you have friends or you know people that are sliding toward the euthanasia or assisted suicide movement, think about this. You don't even have to be religious. Just look at the data, and even if you believed in the principles that govern assisted suicide and euthanasia, once you realize the empirical data, I don't think you could support it. I don't see how anyone could really support it. Internationally, euthanasia is legal in the Netherlands, Belgium, Luxembourg, and Colombia. Assisted suicide in these countries, Canada, even Albania. And pediatric euthanasia in the Netherlands and in Belgium. And soon to be, Canada. It's actually going to be assisted suicide. They're calling it assisted suicide, which I find a little odd. So in the Netherlands, you guys know this. This is the doctors involved in voluntary euthanasia or assisted suicide must meet all of these conditions, technically by law. So this is what happened in the Netherlands. Physician-assisted suicide became legal in about 2000, 2001, and pediatric euthanasia in 2004 and 2005. 3.4% of all deaths are due to euthanasia and physician-assisted suicide, and rising, and you can see it's increased 151% over the last 7 years, up to 6,000 individuals just by 2014. Only 3% are ever evaluated by a mental health professional. Now realize, in every jurisdiction in the world, including the United States, mental health evaluation is not mandatory. It may be recommended by physicians if the physician feels that it is necessary, but if you request suicide, it is not mandatory that you see as a condition of receiving that request mental health evaluation at all. 42 cases of euthanasia as early as 2013 were for severe psychiatric problems, and 18% of physician-assisted suicide cases fail, which then what do? Right, so keep in mind that distinction. Physician-assisted suicide is the individual patient takes the medicine themselves. Well, what happens if they don't die? What happens if they're in a coma? What are you going to do? How are you going to fulfill their wishes? So in those cases, they're euthanized. Someone does it for them, which is euthanasia, even though that is not legal. So, in Belgium, nearly 50% of euthanasia cases are not reported. 41% of unreported euthanasia cases were done by a nurse. And the second opinion consultation guides are often ignored. 75 cases were referred to prosecution for non-compliance with the legal standards, and none were actually ever prosecuted. They were referred for prosecution, but none of them were ever prosecuted. And a 2009 study of 14,000 French physicians, where neither one is legal, showed 0.8 of all deaths were by euthanasia, and only a quarter of those were at the patient's explicit request. So once you buy into this notion that some lives are just not worth living, you open yourself up to the possibility that abuse occurs. Here's some more evidence. 560 people in the Netherlands were euthanized without explicit consent. And Belgium, the rate is 3 times higher than in the Netherlands. Now, this study is really important. In 2007, they studied 4 countries. And the reasons for not obtaining consent for these patients when they were euthanized were the following: a lack of consciousness, 70%, 21% were dementia, mental retardation, then this feeling that euthanasia, quote, was in the best interest of the patient in the estimation of the physician. And then unknown, 2 to 17%. I mean, this is ridiculously bad. Okay, for all the people that kind of promulgate euthanasia and assisted suicide as the upholding of people's autonomy, what this evidence shows you, and it's indisputable, is that when you open that door, people's autonomy get completely trampled. These people aren't choosing death. Someone's choosing it for them. So you could have an opponent of our point of view who says, yeah, I believe that people should have this choice. Well, guess what? It doesn't work out that way. And guess who is bearing the brunt of that? It's not going to be your academic friend who's well-educated and has insurance. It's going to be these kinds of people. Okay, the people that need someone to protect them the most. The pediatric euthanasia protocol is called the Groningen Protocol, and it applies to 3 groups of infants: infants with no chance of survival, infants with a poor prognosis, or non-terminal infants with a, quote, hopeless prognosis who will experience what parents and medical experts deem to be unbearable suffering. So you don't even have to be terminal to euthanize a child in the Netherlands. The suffering of the parents should be taken into account. Okay? So if the parent feels like having this disabled newborn is too much of a burden for them, they can request euthanasia, and all euthanized children thus far, at least at the time that I wrote this, are essentially children with hydrocephalus and spina bifida. In fact, I have met the author of the Groningen Protocol several times. I went to Berlin with him to study, with him and some other scholars, to study Nazi medicine and euthanasia and assisted suicide. And he brags, actually, that there are no more children in the Netherlands with hydrocephalus and spina bifida. That, to him, is a very, very good thing. And he brags with a smile on his face that, in fact, they have eliminated their population of children with hydrocephalus and spina bifida. Now, the problem with this, besides that it actually, the obvious, that it kills newborn babies, okay, is this autonomy, right? So 21% of deaths occurred without parental consent or request. And I'm not making this stuff up. This is empirical evidence. 21% occurred without parental consent. So, and why should we trust physician parental assessments? And probably one of the biggest problems I have, besides the fact that it kills newborn infants, if I were not pro-life and if I were not Catholic, I would ask myself this question: do we even have access to an infant's level of suffering? We can't know the unbearability of suffering for someone else. And so what pediatric euthanasia is basically based on is the suffering of a parent. Okay, because these are newborn infants who may or may not have such neurological anomalies. They may not even be able to be self-conscious and therefore not to experience their own suffering. This is a quote from the Irish bishops, which I love. In 1975, so much has changed in Ireland these days, but in 1975 they said this: "It is often said nowadays that we should not so much consider the mere existence of life, but rather the quality which that life has the prospect of attaining. This argument turns moral principles upside down. Life has the right to quality and dignity because it exists. Life does not derive the right to exist from the quality which circumstances seem likely to give it." Okay, let's let that sink in for a second. That is why I love the Catholic Church. I mean, this is so simple and beautiful and true, and it rings true with everyone, even secularists who I've read this quote to or quoted this to. Yeah, wow. It has an effect on them. In euthanasia and assisted suicide, we really have to remember this. Life has the right to quality and dignity because it exists. Life does not somehow derive the right to exist from the quality which circumstances seem likely to give it. Now, let's talk about our neighbor to the north, Canada. This is from December 29th, 2016. More than 744 people in 6 months were euthanized in Canada since it became legal. So this is between June and December. 744 people have been euthanized. So this idea that, well, if you make it legal, people really won't use it, it'll just destigmatize it, is false. They are thinking about, in Canada, of eliminating conscience protection for Catholic hospitals, institutions, and individuals. And that would effectively kill Catholic healthcare, right? So they would have a big problem, and that's probably part of the problem is because Catholic healthcare, both in Canada and the United States, and certainly probably more so in other parts of the world, provide a significant amount of care for people that nobody else wants to provide care for, right? So part of the debate even here in the United States about conscience protection says, well, you can't have Catholic hospitals shutting down because they provide 60% in the US, between 60 and 70% of inner city care. Okay, even though they occupy about 15% of healthcare nationally in the United States, they provide 60 to 70% of inner city care for the poor. So if you shut those hospitals down, where are people going to go? So we still have that. This is an article that came out in 2017, late 2017. They've already done a cost analysis of medical assistance in dying. See, medical assistance in dying? Made. Helpful. So helpful. And what they say is that medical assistance in dying could reduce annual healthcare expenditures in Canada by between 34.7 and 138.8 million. See, they don't even realize it, but they're outing themselves. What is part of the motivation for assisted suicide? It's cost, right? It's cost. They don't want to say that, they don't want to admit that, because it's kind of unpalatable, but every once in a while they slip up and they publish something like this, which reveals their whole point. Now, this just came out this week, so hot off the presses. Canada is saying, I call it euthanasia, they're calling it physician-assisted suicide for some reason, without parental consent. Okay, so this is really sort of breaking news. This paper, which was published in a very prominent journal, says they don't even mention a conversation with families or parents about how the child dies until after the death of the child occurs in what they call a reflection period. So from the article, it says, patient confidentiality governs the decision about whether or not to include parents in a decision about assisted death, the author said. If capable minors under the age of 18 stipulate they don't want their parents involved, doctors and nurses must respect the patient's wishes. This is what it says. Usually the family is intimately involved in the end-of-life decision-making process, but if, however, a capable patient explicitly indicates they do not want their family members involved in their decision-making, although healthcare providers may encourage the patient to reconsider and involve their family, ultimately, the wishes of capable minor parents with respect to confidentiality must be respected. You talk about the slippery slope, right? So I work in pediatrics where things like sex and drugs and mental health are supposed to be kept completely confidential. So what they're saying is assisted suicide now can be an extension of that. If you're not allowed to tell a parent that your child wants birth control or that your child wants, is on marijuana or what have you, then the parent should also not be involved in a decision if the child wants to end their life. So how about in the United States? You guys probably realize that these states that are in dark blue are states where it's legal. The states that are in the lighter kind of royal blue are states where by judicial pronouncement you cannot ban euthanasia and assisted suicide, and these are states where legislation is pending. You are pretty familiar with these legal landmark decisions, so I'll skip over these, but just realize that there's the Quinlan, Cruzan, and then the Terry Schiavo case that all had an impact on the way we look at this now. Washington versus Glucksberg, this is a U.S. Supreme Court case in which they indicated there was no constitutionally protected right to physician-assisted suicide, but states could pass laws restricting it, but they don't need to. And then these were subsequently upheld: Vaco versus Quips, Vaco versus Quill, Gonzalez versus Oregon. So let's look at the Oregon experience. Once again, they have these safeguards in place, including a 15-day waiting period between requests from a patient who requests assisted suicide. Family notification is recommended. There has to be a 48-hour request between the final written request and the prescription. Okay? It's covered by state Medicaid rules and voluntary reporting. So only 1% of physicians actually participated in the voluntary reporting, mind you. So of patients who died from PAS, 50% of patients did not repeat their request. 5% were unconscious at the time of death, so no concurrent consent. And up to 15% of the attempts failed. The patients did not die. So what happened after that? We just don't know. We don't know. I can guess, but if 15% of these fail, we have no idea what happens afterwards, and officially it's less than 1% of all deaths. Now, why do they really do it? If you look at the empirical evidence for why people request, so this is from the 2015 Oregon Public Health Division, 91% is a loss of autonomy. And again, this gets down to this faulty philosophical anthropology, which people have bought into and under which they operate, that this becomes the only thing of value. 88% said the loss of enjoyment of activities, 79.3% said loss of dignity, loss of bodily functions, good 40% listed a burden on their families. And I look at this list and I think, gosh, that is a call and a demand if ever there was. Are there things we can do that can reverse this short of killing the patient? In the Netherlands, dependency, 1/3 of patients listed dependency as the reason they didn't want to bother their relatives. Now that, in business, we would call that a systems error. Okay, the fact that people actually think this and we do nothing about it except affirm it is very, very sad. These are patients with HIV and AIDS, and they feel the sense of disintegration and a loss of community. The number one reason why patients with HIV in this study said was a loss of community. Now I ask you, why is that something that's acceptable? That our solution to a loss of community is to kill someone, especially a vulnerable patient? Other empirical conclusions: legalization increases the number of requests each year. Pain is not a major determinant of or interest in or actual use of PAS. This is really important because the empirical data shows we can treat most pain. People are not dying in anguish or intractable pain anymore. Pain specialists agree on this. Hematology oncologist doctors agree on this. We can treat pain. Palliative care experts also agree, but we have to distinguish pain from suffering. And then we have to distinguish that there's different kinds of suffering, right? There's suffering that's secondary to the pathophysiology that's going on in your body. And there's also suffering that's due, that what we call existential suffering, right? Suffering just by the fact that you exist. And physician-assisted suicide and euthanasia makes no distinction between those two types of suffering. One, you might be able to do something about. Actually, both you can. So, among the terminally ill, the greater the caregiving needs, the greater the interest in PAS. And there is no data, in Oregon or Washington anyway, on the extension of PAS into non-explicit requests, but that doesn't mean that that's not happening. Okay, so what about the medical complications and safety? Well, the problem that Emmanuel points out in 2016, 43% of cases had no data. This is on the medical complications. There's the safety data, okay? 2.4% had regurgitation of medicine, 0.7%, so 6 people regained consciousness, but that wasn't listed as a complication. Well, the end point is for them never to regain consciousness. So if they regain consciousness, that is a complication. That's an incomplete suicide. The implication of this is that there's underreporting. You can't maintain that this is a safe medical procedure when there is this much complication with it. And how are complications actually noted or accurately noted when there doesn't have to be a physician present at the time of death? There doesn't even have to be a nurse. The length of time between the ingestion and death. So in Oregon, 25 minutes averaged, but it ranged up to 4 days between the time a patient ingested the medicine to kill them and the time they actually died. And in Washington, more than 30% took longer than 90 minutes, and the range was up to 30 hours from the time they ingested the pills until the time they died. So this brings up these questions. What happens if physician-assisted suicide fails? Nobody can answer this question. We have not legalized euthanasia, but you can see where this is going, right? Because if physician-assisted suicide is legalized on the basis of protecting patient autonomy, then it seems like the only thing to do if PAS fails is to go ahead and kill the patient for them. And that's how you let euthanasia in the door as well. But what does it mean to die over 104 hours? Right? So people expect in their minds when they request this a sort of instantaneous and peaceful death, but the empirical data shows you the opposite. That there is a chance that your death could be prolonged. Now if you tell someone, well, there's a chance you could die over 104 hours or over 4 days, they might be less likely to take that route. And then of course there are economic pressures. And then all of this undercuts autonomy. Now, this is something newish that I want to talk about, but depression and this concept of justice, right? So in a Dutch study, patients with depressed mood are 4 times more likely to request euthanasia. 2 to 10% of granted requests in the Netherlands were from people who were noted to be depressed already. Physicians, even oncologists, no offense, are poor judges of depression. And then some will argue against mandatory screening, and no jurisdiction where PAS is legal requires it. Okay? Now I want you to think about this for a second, because this whole concept of euthanasia and assisted suicide is fundamentally premised on this idea that you are upholding a person's freedom. A person's freedom. And in order to be free, your mind cannot be ill. Right? In order to make, that is why if I walk into an ER right now and I say, I want to kill myself, they can hold me for 72 hours against my will. They can pink slip me. Because they realize, well, something, you don't really want to kill yourself. Something's wrong with your mind. That's not fair to you to let us acquiesce to that request on any normal circumstance. But what the data shows you in these countries where it's legal is that the mentally ill, the depressed, are more likely to request it and to have their request granted. One study in Oregon showed a trial of antidepressants changed the mind of 11% of people who requested physician-assisted suicide. Now, the authors of this study said, well, it's only 11%. Okay, which I was kind of shocked about. Like 11% seems like a lot to me, but I guess that's all perspective, especially if you're talking about someone who might have otherwise killed themselves, and all they would have had to have been offered is a trial of antidepressants, and they might have changed their mind. In Oregon, less than 5% received psychiatric evaluations. In Washington, only 4% were referred to psychiatric evaluations. In Oregon, 1 in 6 had clinical depression, and all went on to die. So where is the autonomy? Right? So that is, I think, the one thing that seriously undercuts this argument. And you guys have probably read that now in the Netherlands, you can request euthanasia and assisted suicide even if you are severely mentally depressed. And they've already put to death a severely schizophrenic woman who they claim could not be treated in any other way. So patients with psychiatric disorders, this is from 2016, this study, 110 cases, including one that had a diagnosis of autism. 70% of these cases were women. Most had chronic severe conditions. 55% depression was the primary issue. Less than half of the procedures were performed by psychiatrists. 27% received the procedure from a doctor that was new to them. Once again, this undercutting of the doctor-patient relationship. 11% had no independent psychiatric input, and 24% of these cases, there was a disagreement among the consultants. So none of the safeguards that the people who support euthanasia and assisted suicide claim are in place are actually working, and the people that suffer the most are the people that really shouldn't, are people that really have a vulnerability, which is their ability to be free because of the disease. So, key point number 6, the slippery slope is real. Let's just look at what happened in the Netherlands. The Dutch did not enforce anti-euthanasia laws. They allowed killing, or euthanasia and PAS for terminally ill adults, and then for what they called unbearable suffering. Now you didn't have to be terminal anymore. And then non-voluntary euthanasia for neonates, and then toleration of involuntary euthanasia. And under the Euthanasia Act then, they said, well, children as young as 12 can request it, right? Because they can think like an adult, and they are basically like adults. And 16-year-olds don't even need to have parental consent, only parental involvement. I know, these young guys here are like, yeah, it sounds like it's great to be 16 in the Netherlands until they kill you, all right? Dutch pediatricians feel that older children, not simply infants, may also qualify for euthanasia. Belgium allows both infant and pediatric euthanasia, and in 2011, the mentally ill can request PAS. I mean, there is no doubt that there is a connection between all of these, that the social fabric or the cultural fabric is not static, but it's dynamic. So a lot of philosophers will criticize the slippery slope theory and say, well, there's no logical progression. But as any economist will tell you, human beings and their behavior don't boil down to simple mathematics or deductions. It's a very fluid environment. There are a lot of different factors that go into it, but there's no doubt. I look at it as sort of the, you guys remember from basic science, and I'm going to get this wrong, but when the hemoglobin molecule binds, it's called cooperative binding, right? So when you have these receptors where one molecule binds to the receptor, it opens up the other receptor to allow the next molecule to bind a little bit better, and so on. And that's kind of how I think about this, right? So the ways the slippery slope works is actually when you let one thing in, you think it's oh, well, I've got these protections in place. It's not going to go any further. But just that attachment then opens up another receptor. It makes people more receptive in a way to the next step. This is the one I was talking about in 2015. A Dutch woman was euthanized who had PTSD, anxiety, and other mental illness, secondary sexual abuse. Now just this alone, should make your friends who support assisted suicide and euthanasia really rethink that support. They may, like people used to say in the 80s, communism is a good idea in principle, just not in practice. I don't know if when I was growing up, that's what like young liberal kids used to say. Like, okay, Well, first of all, nothing that's good in principle but it's not good in practice is probably very good. Okay, like, oh, I invented this TV. It's very good in theory, but just not good in practice. Okay, then what good is it? And the same thing with assisted suicide and euthanasia, right? I mean, you may think that, okay, well, I can see where people are coming from with that, but in practice, it's a mess. And guess what happens? People die because of the mess that it is. So this is the latest from the Netherlands. Now you can get euthanasia for a complete life. Okay, so we've gone from terminally ill to now being able to say, I'm done with my life. I've done everything I wanted to do. Now I should be able to die. So in academia, this is Peter Singer. He says, when he's talking about pediatric euthanasia, he says, the main point is clear. Killing a disabled infant is not morally equivalent to killing a person. Very often it is not wrong at all. And how about this one? After birth abortion, why should the baby live? You guys have probably seen this. This was published in one of the more prominent pediatric, or one of the more prominent bioethics journals. And these authors argue that, look, if what a person is that they're conscious, that they can make choices for themselves, we already permit abortion pretty much up until term, and these authors support that. Okay? And we already permit euthanasia for people that can't make decisions for themselves. So they're basically saying, well, if you take a newborn baby, they don't meet the criteria of personhood as we've already defined it for abortion and as we've already defined it for euthanasia. So if a mother has a disabled baby at birth, why should we not be allowed to kill it? And guess what? They don't want you to say infanticide, because that's too negative. All right, so that's why they're calling it after-birth abortion. We shouldn't even call it infanticide. We should call it after-birth abortion. Now, the problem with this, there's limits to data, right? So that's the other thing. And I've given you a lot of data, but there are also limits to data. Emmanuel says, in the United States, the concern that minorities, the disabled, the poor, or other socioeconomically marginalized groups might be pressured to accept PAS doesn't seem to have borne out. And then he says, individual cases of abuse are worrisome, but they are anecdotes and not data, and do not provide support for the notion that abuse is common. So we should allow this to continue because we don't have enough data to show, and remember, the data is voluntarily provided as well. I just think this is an example of how you might see this argument, especially from academicians. Like, well, there's no data that it actually, but first of all, there is. And anecdotes, when you're talking about individual persons, actually count, right? So your liberal friends probably say to you, or maybe not so liberal, maybe some of your Catholic friends say to you, if one person dies unjustly from the death penalty, for example, we should get rid of the death penalty. And most people find that sort of intuitive. But how about if one person dies unjustly from physician-assisted suicide or euthanasia, which they already have? Shouldn't we reconsider the whole project? This is a picture of my son when he was 2.5 or 3 at Niagara Falls. And I point this out because here he is, okay? Here he is, and here's this sign, all right, that says, don't climb up here. And then here he is. Now, so do they need data in order to put this fence and this sign up? No. They put the fence and the sign up because they don't want people to go over the edge. What Emmanuel is arguing here is, oh, wait, we need data before we can actually, restrict assistance. I'm saying there are some things you don't need data for. There are some things you ought to try to prevent before they happen, just because it makes sense. Like little 2.5-year-olds are going to try to jump off here because they're 2.5-year-olds. So put the fence up before you collect data that you don't need, which is some kid jumped off. I just think it's a funny picture. He almost even looks like this sign. Now I know what you're thinking. I probably shouldn't have even taken this picture. Like, here's this dad taking a picture of his son, and then the next thing you know, his son's over the edge. But we yanked him back. All right, so it's a false claim. Okay, that's the other thing. Depressed patients, patients with dementia over 80, economic coercion. There are other types of vulnerability besides race or socioeconomic status. For example, the emotional state of patients and their sense of burden. So Yes, these are not systematic data that I'm presenting, but there are certainly a good number of studies that show patients we would describe as vulnerable are more apt to do this, and patients that should never be allowed to commit suicide, depressed patients already, are using these laws and committing suicide. Let's review these key points. Poor anthropology. The acting person is the central unit of value, not choice. Assisted suicide and euthanasia are not good medicine. They're both bad medicine and bad for medicine. Third, there's abuse, and that is clear from the empirical data. There's absolutely no way you can prevent it, and the fact is that it's happening. It's not something that's going to happen in the future, it's happening now. Fourth, there are complications. There are medical complications with the implementation of the drugs used to commit suicide. Fifth, it is totally an unjust system in which people who are mentally ill or depressed, and this undercuts the principal claim of autonomy. Sixth, the slippery slope is real, and it is happening. Now you notice I did not mention anywhere the Catholic Church's teachings, I did not mention Jesus Christ, I did not mention the Bible. This is all from just philosophy, from just us reasoning it out, thinking it out, and us looking at the data. Okay? But I would urge you all to look at what the Catholic Church teaches about this. Just read even the Gospel of Life by St. Pope John Paul II, the section on euthanasia. It's absolutely beautiful. Dan Sulmazy, who's a prominent Catholic bioethicist, says, suicide is always an act of communication and has profound interpersonal implications. So what can we do? Well, we have to support pro-life alternatives. Okay, advanced care planning. We have to support hospice care and palliative care and authentic pain management. And I understand that the palliative care movement is being infiltrated by people that do not believe what we believe. In my day, like when I was training for medical school, palliative care was seen as the antidote for assisted suicide and euthanasia. Now it's being infiltrated, and that needs to be taken back. Okay, we need to do education and advocacy and use some of the data that we have, and we need to support people and institutions that embrace the goodness of human life and the reality of both death and suffering. And here's where I feel Catholic institutions are not lost. They can play a role. We just need to take them back, okay, from the people that have infiltrated them. I mean, think about this. In 10 or 20 years, Catholic institutions of healthcare, if they're still around, might be the only place where you can go where you're not going to get killed. They should advertise that. Come to St. Anne's Hospital. We won't kill you. We promise. I mean, that could be reassuring to people. So, we have to nurture hope where there is hope. The American Academy of Family Practice is still opposed to assisted suicide. The American Academy of Pediatrics, shockingly, is still opposed to assisted suicide for adolescents and euthanasia. The American Academy of Hospice and Palliative Medicine has now changed its stance to a neutral stance, and the American Psychological Association has changed its stance to a neutral stance. But in this culture and in this day and age, I almost will take that as kind of a victory. We just have to push back, okay, and get them right. Now, this came out this week, I think 2 days ago. The World Medical Association has reaffirmed in the last week its ban or its opposition to assisted suicide and euthanasia. And that's good. The AMA is opposed still, and the American Psychiatric Association is opposed in the non-terminally ill. So even though they might recognize this as being legal, they say people that are not terminal should not have access to that precisely because of the reasons we specified with mental illness. This is a position paper that was published in Annals of Internal Medicine, and it reaffirms the American College of Physicians' position against assisted suicide. So even friends of yours who believe that this is the right thing to do, there's still the majority of groups, of medical groups, are still opposed, and for good reason. Then we should support legislation. I worked with Ohio Right to Life to help push through a bill that explicitly banned assisted suicide and euthanasia. And this is the Catholic Medical Association's boot camp for medical students and residents that we have every year. where over 50 medical students got together and learned the basics of bioethics. These are ways, support your local guild, the St. Thomas Aquinas Guild, and the National Catholic Medical Association. And we can use the data, reason, and experience that I've gone through to help us push back the tide. And finally, we can practice authentic Catholic love. We can offer an enduring presence in our clinical practice to those who fear death, to those who don't see it as a natural part of life, to those who need the presence of another in order to relieve the burden on themselves and their families. We have to protect the right of conscience. I don't think that should be our only goal, because I think we still have a lot of reason to fight this, and we have the winning argument, so we cannot be passive in this fight. And we have to love and support the sacrificial nature of medicine, recommit to it, and like all Indian parents, I'm going to tell you guys the same thing: gently force your kids to go into medicine. I say that this is my son here. When he was about 18 months, which is very late for Indian parents to get their kids their first doctor kit. So I'm actually kind of ashamed to show this picture because I was behind the ball. But you know, I have 5 brothers. We all got into medical school, and my mom used to teach us our night prayers, and we'd all have to line up, you know, and we'd all have to repeat: "Make me a good boy, a clever boy, a doctor." I'm not even joking. That was the third thing. We all learned that prayer. I only bring that up because I think where we need people is in the healthcare profession, right? So if your child or your grandson or whatever is looking at a bug on the ground, you're like, "Oh, that's so interesting. You like bugs? Why don't you become an infectious disease doctor?" All right, something like that. You know, you can figure it out. Oh, they like art. Oh, you know, like a lot of surgeons and plastic, they love art too. They're really good with their hands. There you go. See, like be a little bit more Indian. And then I just want to say this. I mean, I believe that we can and should push back against physician-assisted suicide and euthanasia, because if ever there was a time, it is now. And if there was a truth to the expression, peace through strength, it's in times like this that we have now. So we ought to use reason and data. Those are firmly and absolutely on our side. But we also have a story to tell as Catholics. Stories of presence, stories of sacrifice for the good of others, stories which show acts of love that counter the false narrative. Persons are made for each other, and our challenge is to show the world what that means. And that's it. Thank you.